The noon sun rose pale above the dust as though it, too, was tired of bearing witness. Stagecoach wheels carved ruts through the brittle earth, and a wind drag lay skirts across dry boots as the girl stepped down, clutching a woven satchel in both hands like a last breath. Her dress had been sky-colored once. It had faded now to the ghost of a promise. Behind her, the coachman muttered something about storms coming east, but she heard none of it. She only stared ahead, where the town of Rosebend stood like a held breath between canyon and prairie. A line of onlookers, some squinting, some whispering, stood along the boardwalk, their shadows long and crooked in the dust. No one smiled, not even the man she had come for. Silas Kerrigan leaned against a fence post outside the saloon, arms folded, mouth a flat line. Tall, broad-shouldered, leather-skinned, and somewhere in his late 30s, he wore a duster that hadn't seen soap in months and eyes that didn't blink often. He spat tobacco into the dirt and looked her over like a rancher inspecting a colt with crooked legs. "This her?" he said to no one in particular. No one answered, but everyone heard. She swallowed, the back of her throat dry as charred cornmeal. She tried to speak, but only managed a nod. He grunted, pushed off the post, and walked away without offering his hand. She followed. In the days that came next, they said little. She was shown the ranch, fences, stables, the kitchen in need of fixing. He gave instructions more than conversation. The room she was given had no curtains, no linens, only a bed frame and the dust of women before her. On the fourth evening, over a dinner of beans and boiled bread, he set down his spoon, chewed slowly, and said, "Doctor says you're thin. Heard your papers said nothing about children." She blinked. I've always been healthy." "That ain't what I asked." Her hands curled under the table. She had dreamed once of small fingers in hers, of lullabies whispered by firelight, of warming a cradle in winter. But there had also been the pain, sharp and sudden and followed by red. Then silence. She had never spoken of it again. "I would want children," she said finally. "But can you have 'em?" She looked down. "I don't know." That was all he needed. By week's end, her things were packed by hands not her own. A boy from the barn carted her trunk back to town, and Silas handed her a coin purse with $4.37. He didn't meet her eyes. She asked him once, voice barely above the wind, "Did I do something wrong?" He didn't answer, but his mother, gray and bitter-eyed, said behind him, "You're no good to us, girl. Not if you're broken down there." The word slipped into her ribs like frost through floorboards. She said nothing, just stepped into the cart and didn't look back. Rosebend was not a kind place to return to, not when you return alone. Women at the general store whispered behind sackcloth and buttons. One child pointed and asked if she was a babyless bride. Men tipped their hats, not in greeting but pity. No one offered her lodging, but the town preacher gestured to the old sod house on the eastern rise, abandoned since the widow Harrow died 2 winters back. She cleaned herself, killed 3 rats the first night, patched holes with flour sacks, hauled water from the well, learned to quiet her steps so the walls wouldn't groan. There was no mirror inside. Perhaps that was mercy. She began selling eggs from the 3 hens she bought with the last of her coins, sewed buttons onto torn sleeves in exchange for flour. On Sundays, she stood at the back of the church with her hat in her hands and her eyes on the floorboards. The town never said her name, only titles. That girl, the one Silas sent back, the barren one. She tried not to cry. The prairie didn't know what to do with tears. Each evening she lit a small oil lamp and stitched in silence. Tiny shirts, little caps, blankets patterned with care. She folded them into a cedar chest she had found in the widow's attic. None of them would be worn, not by anyone she knew, but she made them anyway, like prayers sewn into cloth. Once, during a dust storm, she stood at the doorway and watched the town disappear behind a wall of grit. She felt something then, something she couldn't name. Not quite sorrow, not quite rage. It sat inside her chest like a sleeping animal. The next morning, she cut her hair. Not short, not bold, just enough to feel the weight change, to make something her own. She wrapped the fallen strands in muslin and buried them beside the widow's empty garden. Let the wind take what remained. A week later, the whispers changed. A man had been seen helping her lift her sack of flour outside the mercantile. He didn't linger, didn't flirt, just nodded once and walked on. "David Boone," someone whispered. "Odd sort. Keeps to himself. Built his own house with his bare hands." "Too quiet," someone else muttered. "Probably touched." But she remembered his hands, rough but careful. He hadn't flinched when her sack tore and flour dusted her boots. Hadn't said a cruel thing or offered false sweetness. Just picked it up, stitched it shut with string from his coat, and went about his day. That night, she dreamed of Rivers. The days passed quieter after that, though she couldn't explain why. Each week she saw him, always in passing. Once at the well, another time at the edge of her fence where the boards leaned like drunks after a long night. He left a spare nail wedged in the post. She found it and smiled. Small things. Then, just before planting season, she found a brown paper parcel resting on her doorstep. Inside were spring seeds, cabbage, carrots, and sweet peas. No note, but the handwriting on the seed labels was tidy. And something about the way the string was knotted, firm but thoughtful, told her who had tied it. She knelt in the soil behind the sod house, fingers sinking deep into cold earth. For the first time since she'd arrived, she sang, softly, so the wind might carry it before anyone could hear. And when she stood, brushing dirt from her hands, she saw something glinting beside the fence, a nail half-driven, and on it, a note scrawled in plain script. "Wind's turning. Ought to brace the north wall." No name, no signature, but the handwriting was the same. She touched the nail, then the note, then, without knowing why, she laughed, a short, breathless sound that startled even the birds. In a place where words had wounded her deepest, this one note, this one gesture, held no judgment, only care. She wasn't sure what it meant. Not yet, but something had shifted. The air felt different, the soil softer. Her name, whatever it was, sounded closer to being remembered. The wind came in low and constant, dragging dust over the threshold like it belonged there. She tried sealing the cracks in the walls with old cloth, but it found its way in anyway, fine, persistent, and without apology. The days blurred. There were no visitors, only the hens and their clucking rhythm, and sometimes at night, the sound of coyotes far off, reminding her she was still out in the wild. She kept a routine because it kept her from vanishing. Eggs were gathered at dawn, water hauled by noon, mending by candlelight. She stitched until her fingers ached. It wasn't the clothes she needed. Most were barter-bound or tucked away, but the sound of thread pulling through cotton filled the silence with something steady. The townsfolk no longer stared with fresh curiosity. Their judgments had settled into habit. She was no longer a scandal, only a fixture, something they glanced at like the dusty corners of their own homes. A woman who didn't belong, but refused to leave. The preacher's wife once stopped her near the mercantile, spoke in a voice too soft to be kind. "You might find peace, dear, if you stopped wanting so much." She only nodded, not because she agreed, but because fighting cost more than silence. Most days, she felt like a porch without a door, built to wait, but never truly entered. Then came David Boone. It began with moments, unremarkable to anyone else. A glance in passing, a tipped hat, a bag lifted without request. He never asked her name, never offered his, but his presence was different. It did not press or pry. It simply stood nearby, like a tree one could rest against without needing to speak. The first time they truly spoke was not dramatic. He found her trying to lift a sack of feed onto her cart outside the store, and when the sack gave and spilled grain like tiny stones, she cursed beneath her breath and bent to scoop it with shaking hands. He crouched beside her without a word, gathering kernels in his palms. "I had it," she said. "I know." Their eyes met briefly. His were amber brown, like sunlit dirt. He didn't smile, just nodded and helped lift the patched sack onto the cart. Then he tipped his hat and walked away. She watched him go, the silence he left behind curiously warm. After that, she noticed the quiet things. A broken fence post by her garden mended one morning. A wooden bucket left when hers split. The smell of pine from his coat when he passed by. He wasn't courting her. That much was certain. There were no flowers, no offers, no words wrapped in sugar. Just help. Quiet help. She learned he had no kin in Rosebend, built his house himself past a river bend, made his tools, grew his food, mended his boots, talked little, drank less. Townsfolk called him odd, but no one called him cruel. The blacksmith said David could fix a wagon wheel blindfolded. The teacher once told a story of how he carved a child's crutch out of walnut when no one else would. He did what needed doing, then disappeared. And still, the town whispered, not about him, about her. She's playing a long game now, one woman muttered. Can't have her own, now she wants someone else's. She's cursed, said another. You watch, anything she touches dries up. She tried not to listen, but words like dust found their way in. At night, she sat by the small fire and opened her cedar chest. Inside were the pieces of dreams. Stitched booties, a quilt made from scraps of dresses she'd never worn, a carved rattle once bought from a peddler when she still believed her body might obey her heart. She held them like memories she hadn't lived, then folded them away. Her loneliness didn't scream. It whispered. It made her forget the last time someone said her name with kindness. It pressed into her shoulders like the ache before rain. One morning, she found a note tucked beneath a flat stone by the garden. Just a single line. Try planting the sweet peas first. They take better to cold soil. No name, but the handwriting was familiar, neat, deliberate. She smiled without meaning to. She began to expect him, in a way. Not with certainty, but with hope that flickered at the edges of her chores. When he passed near the well, she offered water. When he leaned over a fence to mend a loose board, she brought tea. They spoke only in fragments. He told her once, while watching her coax a seedling from the dirt. My brother used to say spring was for fools. I reckon he was right. Do you think I'm foolish? She asked. He didn't look at her when he answered. No, just brave enough to try again. She wanted to ask what happened to his brother, but some silences felt earned. She didn't know why he helped her. Perhaps because she asked nothing in return. Perhaps because he saw her not as someone broken, but someone still trying. She found herself speaking more when he was near, telling him stories, small ones, of how her father once taught her to ride by placing a coin beneath her knee, of the time she tried to make bread and set the flour bag on fire, of how, once, a robin nested in her windowsill, and she sat so still the chicks never feared her. He didn't laugh, but the corner of his mouth would twitch, and that was enough. One evening, as she watched the sun dip behind the cottonwoods, she told him the truth. They said I couldn't have children. No, doctor ever said it straight, but I bled too long. And when I loved someone once, it didn't matter. I was just less. He looked at her then, fully. No pity, just a deep, steady gaze. You ain't less. She couldn't answer. Her throat closed around the words. Later, alone again, she stared at the small patch of earth where the sweet peas now climbed, their tendrils reaching up like fingers toward light. She touched one, and it curled gently against her skin. The next morning, a storm rolled over the plains. Dark clouds gathered, and wind toward the coop. One of the hens escaped, flapping wild through the rain. She chased into the field, hair plastered to her face, skirts soaked through. She fell once, laughed in spite of herself, and crawled through mud after the bird, caught it, eventually, tucked against her chest like something sacred. When she stood, David was there. He said nothing, just held out his hand to help her up. She took it, breathless and dripping. For a long moment, they stood close, the storm softening behind them. She looked down at her muddy dress and grinned. Well, I suppose that's one way to catch a chicken. He smiled then, fully, openly. It lit his face like firelight. That evening, she found a wooden box by her door. Inside was a set of carved seed markers, each bearing names in careful letters: cabbage, onion, pea, hope. At the bottom of the box, one word carved alone. Yours. She stared at it until the lamp burned low. The night didn't feel as heavy after that, and though the wind still slipped through the walls, it no longer brought only dust. It brought something else, something just beginning. By the time the snow receded and the earth softened beneath her boots, the girl had learned the sound of silence, so well it almost spoke to her. It hummed in the spaces between chores, sang in the wind's quiet sighs, and tucked itself around her at night like a threadbare quilt. Spring came slow, hesitant, more suggestion than promise, but it came, and with it, so did color. Pale crocuses pushed through the thaw. The sweet peas she planted, David's peas, curled toward the sun as if grateful to be called into being. She worked harder now, not for survival alone, but for rhythm, for the shape it gave her days. Her hands had toughened, fingertips calloused and proud. Her skin brown beneath the sun, and her hair, grown longer again, swayed freely down her back. She wore no corset, no bows, only cotton dresses and the faint scent of rosemary oil, which she used more now that she begun to care again how the wind carried her. David Boone had become a regular fixture, though never predictable. He arrived when needed and sometimes when not, leaving things repaired without being asked. Hinges, fence posts, a roof tile slipped loose. He came with a hammer in his pocket and silence in his mouth, but his eyes held something warmer than any words she'd ever known. They spoke more now, never about the town or the past, but about things that felt like anchors. He asked about her garden, and she told him the way she learned to whisper to the soil. She asked him how he learned to fix a wagon wheel, and he said, by breaking the first 3. They passed time not in stories, but in the weight of presence, in the offering of time. One morning, he brought over planks of pine and said, only, you need a gate that don't groan like it's dying. She made coffee, brought it out in a chipped mug. He took it without a word, set it near the fence, and worked while she weeded the peas, though it sang beneath his tools. She liked that he didn't fill the air with talk. She liked the way he measured twice and cut once, the way he stepped back to look at things not just with pride, but care. When he finished, she touched the new gate and said, it's kind. That's what it feels like, a kind gate. He raised a brow. Never heard lumber called that before. I mean, it's strong, but it opens easy. He gave a quiet laugh, low and rare, and for the first time she saw the boy he must have once been. She found herself smiling more after that. On a Thursday, when the sky hung heavy with the scent of rain, and the hens clucked like gossips behind her, she found a flat wooden figure tucked beside her porch. A small doll, hand-carved, no more than the length of her palm. Its face was simple, its dress notched in shallow detail, and a name burned into the back. Hope. She held it a long time, thumb tracing the tiny letters. Then she went inside, opened the cedar chest, and placed it among the soft things she'd made. It didn't feel like foolishness anymore. It felt like faith. Later that week, a boy from town, Rory Talbot, no older than 10 and mean like his father, threw a rock at one of her hens. She saw the flash of white feathers scatter, heard the angry cry of the bird, and then the boy's laughter. Her feet hit the porch before her breath caught. She didn't yell, just walked straight toward him, steady and unflinching. Pick up that rock, she said. The boy blinked. What for? Because if you can throw it, you can carry it. He scoffed, but something in her stare made him bend and lift it. Now walk it back to where you found it. The boy hesitated, then obeyed, half scowling, half curious. David stepped around the corner, just as the boy trudged off. He said nothing at first, just watched her watch the boy disappear down the path. You didn't have to say it like that, he said. Say what? Like his hands could still be taught something. She shrugged. I was raised by someone who believed bruises were the only way to make a point. I'm tired of bruising. He didn't reply, but when she looked at him, his eyes were softer than usual, like sun through river water. That night, she couldn't sleep. The stars were too loud, too many, too bright. She lit a candle and sat by the chest, pulled the doll into her lap, held it like something sacred. She remembered her younger sister, lost a fever, how she'd sung to her, even as her body burned with the sickness, how their mother hadn't cried, hadn't even looked at the girl as they laid her beneath the cottonwood tree, only said, some girls are born empty, The Lord takes back what don't feel. She had carried that sentence like a stone under her ribs. Now she set it down. The next morning, David knocked, not loud, just a quiet rap against the wood. "I want to show you something," he said. She followed him past the tall grass into the trees where the air smelled green and ancient. There, in a clearing, stood a cradle, rough-hewn but sturdy, shaped by hand and heart, not perfection. It rocked slightly in the breeze. "I had leftover lumber," he said. She didn't speak, didn't trust herself to. Her hands found the edge of the cradle and held it like a child might hold a wish. "You made this for me?" "For her," he said, nodding toward the doll she placed his hand days ago. "I don't understand." "You didn't throw her away," he said. "Figured maybe you shouldn't be the only one holding her." She felt the tears rise, hot and reluctant. She let them stay. The cradle wasn't just wood. It was belief carved into shape. That spring, everything began to grow faster. The sweet peas bloomed in full color. Birds returned. The town's cruel glances grew rarer, dulled by repetition or perhaps by distance. People had stopped expecting her to leave. Now they simply tried not to see her, which was its own kind of peace. David came more often now. Not daily, but enough that her days missed him when he didn't. They didn't speak of feelings, never held hands, never danced. But once, she found herself brushing dirt from his shoulder like it mattered. Once, he lifted her foot onto his knee to check a blister, gentle as water. They didn't explain those moments. They let them be. Then a letter arrived, hand-delivered by the preacher, who held it like it might bite. It was from Silas. She read it aloud with David sitting near, his arms folded but still. "You were sent away too fast. Things changed. The land needs hands. If you're willing to try again, I'd let you." That was all. No apology, no warmth, just the assumption of her return. She folded the letter slowly, set it in the fire without comment. David didn't say anything for a long time. Then, in a voice not quite steady, he asked, "Do you still want what he wanted?" She looked at him, really looked, at the man who'd mended her roof, her fence, and something in her soul she hadn't named yet. "No," she said. "What he wanted never had anything to do with me. What I want, I don't know what it is, but it's growing." He looked away, nodded once, and then, in a voice quieter than she'd ever heard, said, "I'd build more cradles, if you ever needed." She turned her face toward the light. Spring had arrived without warning, and so had something else. In the days that followed, they built a porch together, hammered nails side by side. When they sat on it that first evening, watching the sun melt into the prairie, he reached over, not to take her hand, but to place a carved spoon in her palm. "For when you teach her to eat," he said. "She doesn't exist," she whispered. "Doesn't mean she won't." Her fingers closed around the spoon. It fit her hand like a promise. That night, she dreamed not of loss, but of a home. Not a grand one, just one with warm floors and laughter that lingered. She dreamed of firelight and tiny shoes by the door, of boots she recognized and hands that never let go. In the dream, someone called her name, not girl, not Baron, not Les, but her name, spoken with reverence. And she woke up with tears on her cheeks and the dawn on her lips, whispering his name back. Spring thickened into early summer, the air sweet with blooming sage and something unspoken. The garden, once a timid patch of green, had grown proud beneath her hands. Every leaf, every bloom, whispered its allegiance. The peas had climbed high now, their delicate tendrils curling with insistence. She watched them sometimes with quiet wonder, thinking how even small things could insist on growing. David had not kissed her, had not declared anything aloud, yet the world had shifted underfoot. He came in the mornings sometimes, always with purpose, sometimes to mend a hinge, sometimes to bring wood, sometimes to just sit in the cool of the porch and carve without urgency. They talked the simple things, weather, soil, how to keep slugs from the cabbage, but beneath each word floated another language, one of proximity, of comfort, of patient attention. He noticed when she was too quiet and left her space. She noticed when his shoulder ached and brought a cloth soaked in mint and vinegar. Their kindnesses were small, almost invisible to outsiders. But she measured her days in them now. The town, as ever, noticed everything and understood little. At the general store, two women paused their gossip as she approached the counter. One sniffed and said loud enough to be heard, "Some women don't know when to stop chasing what isn't meant." The other nodded, like trying to bloom where there's no rain. She didn't answer, just paid for her flower and left. But the words clung like burrs, small and sharp. She walked home slow that day, past the old creek where the water still ran thin. Her reflection glanced back from the ripples, weathered, sun-touched, but whole in a way she'd never been before. That night, as dusk settled in lavender hues, David brought over a cradle, the same one he'd shown her months ago, now varnished, smooth, strengthened. He set it gently on the porch and stepped back, not expecting anything. "I added rockers," he said. She crouched beside it, ran her fingers along the grain. "Why?" He shrugged. Seemed like it ought to move with her. "When she gets here." She looked up sharply. "There's no child coming." "I know. You speak like there is. I don't need to see the rain to believe in the seed." She blinked, but the weight in her chest was not pain. It was something bigger, fuller. She stood, walked to the porch steps, and sat. He joined her after a pause. The sky was swarming with stars, that kind of restless brightness that only shows itself out here where the land is wide and wants to be heard. "I never told you everything," she said, her voice barely more than the wind. He waited. "When I was 16, I held my baby sister through her fever. My mother didn't help. She said the Lord was taking back what wasn't strong enough to keep. After she passed, I started bleeding too much. The doctor said it might stop. It never did. They said I was faulty." His jaw tense, but he didn't interrupt. "So when Silas asked for a bride, I thought maybe I'd earn something just by trying. I was wrong. He didn't want me. He wanted a body that could bear sons. That's all I ever was to him." She paused, voice quivering. "I've lived every day since trying not to believe that's all I'll ever be." He turned toward her, his expression unreadable but deep. "You made a garden grow in hard ground," he said. "You fed yourself when others would have laid down. You stitched clothes no child had yet, and you kept faith anyway. If that's not strength, I don't know what is." A long silence followed. Then he added quieter, "And I never once saw you as a womb." She looked at him then, really looked, at the lines around his eyes, the scar near his jaw, the gentle calluses on his hands. She breathed slowly, as if breathing him in. "I don't know what to do with you," she whispered. "You don't have to do anything. I ain't a burden. I'm just here." The quiet that followed was not hollow. It was filled with presence, and she leaned her head gently against his shoulder. He didn't move, didn't stiffen, just stayed. In the morning, the town awoke to news. A widow from the outskirts had passed during childbirth. Her babe survived, a girl, swaddled and silent at the chapel door. No kin came forward. No one wanted to raise another's mistake. She heard the news on her walk to town. At first, she walked past the chapel, heart pounding. But something in her legs turned her around, and before she knew it, she stood at the chapel's back steps, staring down at the bundle swaying gently in a woven cradle. The baby was still, eyes closed, her face round and quiet, breath shallow but strong. A note pinned to the blanket read, "Only mercy." She stepped forward, hands trembling, and when she lifted the bundle, the child stirred, wrinkled her nose, and gave a sound not quite a cry, not quite a sigh. It sank into the woman's chest like a river finally finding its course. Footsteps sounded behind her. "David." "You don't have to," he said. She didn't look back. "She's already mine." "But the town." "I don't care about the town." She held the child tighter. At home, she laid the babe in the carved cradle. It rocked softly, as if it had always waited for this. David stood in the doorway, unsure. "I don't know what comes next," she said. "Neither do I. But I'd like you to stay." "I will." For days, she didn't leave the homestead. The baby, named not Mercy but Hope, ate little but slept often. Her cries were small but sharp. Each one woke the woman with urgency, not panic. She held her, sang to her in tones only the wind had heard before, songs without words, promises without certainty. At night, she found herself staring into the cradle, as though it might vanish, as though the world might wake her and say, "You are still barren. This was only a dream." But every morning the baby breathed, lived, needed, and that need did not weigh her down. It made her taller somehow. One evening, as she tried to soothe hope through a fit of restlessness, David entered without knocking. He took the child with gentle hands and began rocking her in a rhythm so sure it startled the woman into stillness. "You've done this before," she said. "No, you look like you have. I watched someone once. That's all." Hope quieted in his arms. Her small hand curled around his finger. The woman's heart ached, not with fear, but longing. "What are we?" she asked. He didn't look up. "Whatever you want us to be. I don't know what that is." "That's all right. We've got time." And still the town muttered. Some called it unnatural. Others said she bewitched him. One man spat near her feet at the market. She didn't flinch. David stood beside her, silent, unmovable. The preacher's wife came by once with a loaf of bread and eyes that held some measure of regret. "I heard what you did," she said, uncertain. No one else stepped forward. "She didn't need everyone," the woman replied. "She just needed someone." The wife nodded, left the bread, and didn't say more. At the edge of summer, they stood together, her, David, and Hope, beneath the cottonwood where she'd once buried a lock of hair. Fireflies rose from the grass. The moon hung low. David carved something into the side of the porch that night. Hope Boone. The woman traced the letters long after he'd gone to sleep. She stayed outside, watching the cradle sway gently in the breeze, now empty but full in its own way. And when morning came and the rooster crowed, she smiled without shame. She had not given birth, but she had become a mother. The fever came suddenly, like a thief in the night, small and cruel. Hope's brow burned before sunrise, and by noon her breast came shallow, her cries weak. The woman didn't sleep. She bathed the child's skin with cool cloths, whispered songs through cracked lips, and held her like a prayer that refused to end. She didn't ask for help, not out of pride, but from the old instinct of a woman used to tending pain alone. But David knew. He saw it in her eyes when he came with milk that morning. The panic masked beneath forced calm, the stiffness of her back as if uprightness might ward off loss. He set the bottle down and went to her. "How long?" "Since dawn," she said. "She won't keep food. She's so warm, David, so small." She didn't cry. Not yet. Not when there was still something to be done. He took her hands. "I'll ride to Miss Lantry. She keeps medicine herbs. She's 6 miles out. I've ridden farther for less." She nodded once and turned back to the cradle, already halfway into another hymn. David left without another word, and his horse's hooves carried desperation through the earth. The hours that followed were slow and loud. Every creak of the wood, every shift in the child's breath, every cry too soft or too strong made her chest tighten. She boiled water. She pressed her forehead to Hope's. She begged no god by name, but spoke to the sky all the same. "Don't take her," she whispered. "I only just found her. Let her stay. Let her stay." She remembered holding her sister like this. Too late, too helpless. That had been her first loss, and she believed herself cursed since. But this child, this quiet gift from a world that never gave anything freely, had turned her grief to soil, had rooted something in her worth tending. And now, again, she stood on the edge of loss. The door burst open near dusk. David, breathless and wild-eyed, held a small satchel to his chest. "Tansy, feverfew, willow bark," he said. "Boil it strong." Her hands shook as she brewed it. They fed the liquid to Hope in drops. First one, then two, then a slow stream of bitter gold that coated the child's lips. She didn't fight it, didn't cry. That was what frightened the woman most. When it was done, David sat on the floor beside the cradle, sweat glistening on his brow. She curled beside him, shoulder against his. "She's strong," he said. She has to be. The fever broke just before dawn. One soft whimper, then a breath that filled the room like a bell. Hope turned her face and opened her eyes, glassy but aware. The woman sobbed then, not from fear, but from the weight of holding on. She pressed her lips to the child's cheek and held her so tightly the cradle creaked. Outside, the sun pushed gold across the prairie, and the birds dared sing again. By midday, word had spread. The preacher arrived with a face full of judgment and some forced benevolence. Behind him came Silas. He hadn't changed. Still tall, still broad, still sure of his right to everything he reached for. His eyes flicked once to the child, then to David, then to her. I heard there's an orphan here. The woman said nothing, only stood taller. Place like this, he said, gesturing, can't raise a child proper, especially not by a woman who— Say it, she snapped. Silas paused, surprised. You were given back to the town for a reason. She wasn't given, David said, stepping forward. She was thrown away. Silas turned to him. You think she's yours to keep now? David didn't flinch. She ain't an object, and neither is a child. She's not even hers, Silas spat. You're raising a child that's got nothing to do with you. That's no family. The woman stepped forward then, holding Hope in her arms, calm as still water. She has everything to do with me, she said. She's mine because I held her when no one else would. She's mine because I sang her to sleep while the rest of you looked away. She's mine because I chose her. That's what makes a mother. Silas snorted. You're playing house with someone else's mistake. David took a step closer. His fists were tight at his sides, his jaw tight. That child is the first good thing in this town, in a long time. You do well to step back. Silas looked between them, measuring. The woman stood barefoot on her porch, hair messy, sleeves rolled, child at her breast, and looked more whole than she ever had under his roof. He turned with a grunt, muttering, You'll regret this. No, she said, with something almost like joy. I'll remember it. When he was gone, and the preacher with him, David turned to her. You didn't need me. You came anyway, she said. Hope stirred then, blinking up at them both. David reached out, not to take her, but to touch her tiny hand. It closed around his finger. She's stronger than both of us, he said. Yes. He stepped back, unsure again, uncertain whether to stay or leave. But she looked at him and said, You built her a cradle before she existed. You carved her name into wood. You brought her medicine when she couldn't ask. He swallowed hard. You're the only father she's ever known. He blinked fast, then nodded. Then I'll stay. That night, they didn't talk much. They sat on the porch, watching Hope sleep inside the cradle David had built and the woman had blessed. The air was soft, and the stars looked close enough to hold. She reached for his hand, slow and certain, and he took it. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel like a visitor in her own story. At sunrise, Hope laughed for the first time, a soft, sudden sound like bells caught on the wind. And the woman, who once thought her body too broken to hold a child, smiled. She had bled and wept and stitched and buried and planted. She had waited. And now she was called mother, not by blood, by becoming, by choosing, by staying. The cradle rocked. And so did the world. And somewhere, years from now, when Hope would ask her where she came from, the woman would say, I found you in silence and loved you into song.